Hello, everyone. This is our last recording for Introduction to Homiletics. And we've enjoyed being with you in this format and hope that you have found these videos helpful. This last one is a kind of way of wrapping up the course by returning to one of the first and last questions of the course, which has to do with your metaphor for yourself as a preacher. So this topic is really a way of synthesizing all the material of the course in a single image. And we would like you to think about and then write the short paper about your metaphor for yourself as a preacher. One of the things you can think about is you can go back and look at the Tom Long chapter 1 in his book, The Witness of Preaching, where he has the 4 different models, which are all metaphors. They're all images. The herald, the pastor, the storyteller, the witness, all of which are ways of describing what preaching is, what the purpose of preaching is, what our theology of preaching is, what the purpose, the meaning, what we think we're doing when we preach. All of it can be kind of crystallized into a metaphor. And the 4 that he comes up with all have different theological presuppositions, all have different ways of making sense of the various elements that we have talked about in this course. For instance, a metaphor for oneself as a preacher captures the way that you think about your relationship to a text, the text of scripture. It has to do with the way you think about your own identity as a preacher, which was what we talked about at the beginning of the course quite a bit. Your preaching autobiography, your testimony, the cultural particularity matrix, all of those pieces. It is a way of thinking about your relationship to your congregation. The herald metaphor has a very different understanding of the congregation than does the pastor metaphor. For instance, the herald, you start with scripture and you declare it to the congregation, whereas with the pastor, you're more starting with the experience of the congregation and then moving from that to the role of scripture. So these different elements factor differently in different metaphors. The metaphor can capture your relationship to the world, which was the piece that we just talked about last week. And also all your metaphors relate to how you understand sermon form and craft. Because, for instance, if you think that the role of the preacher is to declare the scripture to the people in the sort of the herald model, then very likely your sermon form is going to start from scripture and move toward the people. But if you want to start with the experience of the people and then move toward scripture, that might affect the order in which you lay out your sermon. So all of the different themes of the course can be gathered up in this idea of the metaphor for yourself as a preacher. And one of the kind of founding metaphors that we've been working with throughout this semester, because we're an Anglican, we're trying to show you an Anglican mode of preaching, is this metaphor of the preacher as priest or the sermon as sacramental. And there's been the 4-fold kind of shape that we've walked through: the taking, the blessing, the breaking, and the giving. We've sort of shown how those factor into the different parts of the course. So what we're going to do first with this video is we're each going to talk a little bit more about our metaphor for ourselves as a preacher and how that to us makes sense of why we preach and what we think is happening when we preach. And it may be that we're using the same metaphor that we talked about at the very beginning. We all shared that at the beginning of the course. It may be that we actually come up with a different metaphor because these metaphors keep changing. No metaphor is really perfect. And so as you're working on your paper, you may discover that every single one has its strengths and its weaknesses. But the more powerful ones do tend to draw out some of the essential quality of preaching. So we're each going to talk a little bit about our metaphors, and then we're going to talk a little bit about where preaching goes from here in terms of the curriculum, what we offer in the future, and how that ties into the approach that we have developed in this course. And then finally, we will close with talking about, in brief, why we preach, which is kind of that central theological question about preaching. Okay, so I'm going to invite one of my colleagues to start by sharing their metaphor for themselves as a preacher. Could I ask Dr. Jefferson to start with that question?
Certainly. In reflecting on the course of the semester and the ways in which I've had to respond as a preacher, I think I said I was at. I want to say we started off, and I said I was an athlete or something. But I think if I want to narrow the scope a little bit, it's more of a basketball player, and there's the skill development, but there's actually the playing of the sport. And so, as a preacher, you learn individual skills. Yeah, you can go out there and preach without some of the technical aspects, but there's an ease in playing when one is familiar with the skills of said task, and learning the skills and being able to manifest them, in the game situation, which is in front of people, with people, engaging in that, home and away, places in which it's familiar, not familiar. It then helps me to think about the task of preaching in terms of having strategies, not just being talented. It's about understanding the different spots on the floor and how to arrange your offense and what you're trying to do at different times of the game. And so preaching for me in many ways is the same thing, where there's tremendous strategy, but the strategy at the end of the day is out the window when it comes to the actual doing of the thing. And so the way that I organize and design my sermons, I design them with an intent based on where I feel God is leading the sermon. And so that is my game plan, but it may not go the way that I think it should go or the way that I intended based on things that I could or could not factor before or after. So being knowledgeable about what I'm trying to accomplish, being connected to what God is asking me to do, and having confidence in the game plan allows me to think about what am I trying to achieve every time that I go out there and preach. So it much like sports, it seems like it's a physical thing. When someone's neatly, they're physically gifted, and that physicality overshadows the tremendous intellect that it takes to be able to position oneself to do something on a consistent basis. And so sometimes preaching, people say it seems natural, kind of like sports, and there's a natural element to it, but just like anything that has a professional guild or grade to it, talent doesn't necessarily determine success. There's other skills and other disciplines, and much like an athlete, there's a way that you have to take care of yourself to be able to do the task. And so with as many times that I've had to preach over the last couple of years, I felt more like a basketball player having to play games night in and night out, where having that mentality has helped me then to think about how to arrange my life so that I could then be a more effective and efficient preacher. So thinking about it that way is given the different components of preaching, like the different aspects of our journal and the different assignments from the course, it gives those things meaning by being able to draw them through the thread of being this basketball player. So hopefully that makes sense a little bit into how I've tried to approach at least the last couple of years of preaching and having to write sermons and be a sermon on a regular basis.
Right. Professor Turner, what would you say?
So at the beginning of the semester, I think the metaphor that I used was Zoom lens, which I picked partly because it was true, but also because it was a very clever little pun for this pandemic time. As I've thought about it more, I think where my preaching is right now, Zoom lens is actually a little bit too static. One of the things that's useful about the whole metaphor idea is to think about the verbs associated with the metaphor. So if you're cultivating or tending or pulling or whatever verb might be associated, and a lens really just kind of sits there. But I have been thinking about myself a little bit more as a filmmaker, and some of that is because most of the preaching that I'm doing has been on screen. But also in that, I mean, this is Mark in good contrast to what you said. That the way that I am preaching right now is not very goal oriented or achievement oriented as much as it is, I like the phrase journey oriented. There's a lot of discovery and discovery of emotional life. I'm drifting into a lot of narrative preaching right now. And so that sense of creating a scene where people can put themselves and be immersed in and make their own discoveries, and pulling in close on some things and panning out on others. um, I think that's the metaphor for what I'm up to these days.
Um, let's see. So my metaphor at the beginning of the semester was a kind of like a spelunker, sort of a treasure hunter in deep places, and the fact of having to take risks and venture down into dangerous territory to draw up a treasure that can be helpful to people. Um, I looked back on my notes from last year when we did this final class meeting for folks, and I said last year that I was a sailor, and actually that really appeals to me now. Partly because I think what sailing, and I love sailing, and partly what it is this interesting balance of skill that you bring, and skill that and qualities that the boat has, but then you really something much bigger than yourself. You've got the wind, which can often be very overwhelming and scary. You've got the waves and the ocean, which is of course infinite, if you're sailing on the ocean. And so you are in this tiny little boat that you have the ability to navigate, but is being what you're doing is harnessing these forces that are much bigger than the human. And to me, that image captures the way in which preaching is a relationship with this divine mystery that is so much bigger than we are. And we do bring all these skills. We bring this knowledge. So sailors have to have the deep knowledge of how to use boats, how to manage that, how to navigate, how to read charts, all of that, which to me is sort of the way that we work with scripture and tradition, but is sort of given over in this sort of um, combination of skill and surrender to these larger forces. And also sailing. I mean, people do sail solo, but it's basically safer as a group enterprise. And so having a whole crew, having it be a kind of communal endeavor is important to me, and that is how I sort of see the congregation, as not just passive recipients, but as actively involved in the creation of a sermon. And then the final thing about it is there's this sense of both risk and freedom, this incredible sense of freedom in being out in these elements that are that sweep you up. So risk, freedom, and joy. There's this amazing joy in being submerged in this incredibly beautiful landscape and experience, which I do find preaching to be fundamentally is incredibly joyful, because I think it is this event of giving yourself over to God and discovering the power of God and the goodness of God. So that's how I would describe my metaphor at the moment. And these are wonderful, all three, and very different. One of my students asked me yesterday in section, does your metaphor have to be sort of a human being? And I said, no, absolutely not. Even though Tom Long's models are, and all three of ours are, actually, you could come up with others. I've known people to talk about being a lighthouse, or being a garden, or being, and as Anne said, a zoom lens. So you don't have to pick a person. You can pick a landscape or an object or something else. But we want you to think about it, and think about what it means to you as a preacher. And in each one of our examples here, you can see that there's also a horizon for growth. So there's a way in which we each are moving in. The metaphors talk about not only where we are now, but where we want to go. So for me, in terms of the sailing metaphor, it would be probably becoming more able to surrender to these larger forces, or more open to the joy and the beauty of preaching than I am now. So even being able to relinquish control more than I have at the moment. I don't know if either of you all professors have a thought about where the metaphor is taking you in terms of your next steps as preachers? Do either of you wish to speak to that?
I think for me, it's the life of an athlete, you know, and Paul, in some of his writings, has summoned that imagery up as well. There's always a deeper dedication to one's craft. There's always more, there's always greater discipline that lies ahead. And so that discipline um, calls me to continue to find ways to to equip myself and to better myself and to best myself in service of God. So I have this potential I've been given, and so I want to do everything I can to mine it in an active way. So I think that metaphor always sends me back to the same disciplines. So the better I do, the more I need to go back to the things that I've been doing. And so I think that's a healthy way for me to continue to keep the equilibrium necessary to do this in a way that I can do with integrity.
Right. And how about you?
You know, perhaps not surprising from the conversation we had upon spirituality, oh, so many moons ago. I just feel more and more drawn into wonder, not necessarily contemplation, but just the noticing and appreciation of beauty, and feeling how profoundly revolutionary that is, how life-giving that is. You know, and preaching as a way for me to do that with myself, and to encourage other people just to actually to open their eyes and see. It feels more and more like where my vocation is at.
Mm.
And filmmakers do that, we hope.
Yeah, great. So we want to talk a little bit here about sort of the trajectory of our curriculum in homiletics and how it builds on these emphases that we've had in this course, and also to talk a little bit about Deep Calls to Deep as the program that we hope you will all think about in the future, and how it too draws on the emphases that we've had here. You probably know I'm teaching a course in the spring called Preaching in the Anglican Tradition, which is an effort to sort of mine the riches of our tradition as Anglicans, to look deeper into the sacramental analogy with preaching, but also the strong social justice emphasis that has been part of our Anglican tradition, although maybe not as well known as some other parts of the tradition. And then the emphasis on poetry and beauty and art, which has been part of this course, but is definitely part of our birthright as Anglicans. And the sort of mystical dimension of preaching that parallels the mystical core of the Eucharist that we want to draw upon. So that one of the things that we feel as having created this course is that preaching, the other day I was in a meeting with members of the Lilly Foundation that fund our preaching grant, and Deep Calls to Deep, and they asked, how has the teaching of preaching changed over the past 5 years or so? And I said, I think the teaching of preaching has to be much more holistic than it has ever been before. That teaching people how to preach is much more about the formation of character and of persons and body, mind, spirit, and emotion and imagination, and not so much about techniques, which is what this course has been, is that forming of the whole person, we hope. So my courses on embodying the sermon are really a deepening of that. So again, embodiment for me is not about delivery techniques, but really about integration of the whole person so that you can be fully present in preaching. And then another course that I am going to teach, not this spring, but in a year's time, is biblical storytelling, which we all touched on a little bit in the embodiment of text assignment. But in my experience, has been one of the best ways that you can develop a relationship with scripture that's very profound, is to figure out how you want to embody and perform it. And then put that together with other people's performances to create a whole proclamation of, say, the Gospel of Mark or Paul's letter to the Philippians or the book of Genesis. Those are some of the ones I've done in the past. So, and then the other course that I'm going to teach at some point soon is one that I developed as an independent study last spring, which was preaching in a time of eco crisis. So our eco crisis has been a little bit overshadowed by all the other crises of the moment, the pandemic and the crisis of racism and racial injustice and our reckoning with that. But we all kind of know in the back of our minds that we face an existential threat to the planet, which is unfolding in our midst, and trying to figure out how to preach in response to that has its own set of challenges, which have to do with motivating people in the midst of what can feel like an overwhelming problem, preaching politically, but also sort of stirring the imagination and the emotions and all things that really build on some of the emphases in this course. So those are some of the things that I plan on teaching. And now I'd like to hear from Dr. Jefferson about courses and emphases in his teaching that build on what we've been doing in this course.
Thank you for that. I think one of the good things about my job is that I get a chance to play the tandem. And so Dr. Hook in many ways kind of sets the homiletical direction. And so I get a chance to support that with my interests. And so I think we provide a fairly well-rounded homiletical approach. And I think Professor Turner, she kind of holds both ends against the middle, so to make sure that we don't fly off the homiletical rails. And so, you know, in my contribution to our homiletical think tank, if you will, is more about, you know, engaging the prophetic realm, and prophetic in terms of thinking about what does it mean to preach in the public square, in terms of engaging politics, engaging some of those structural issues, and how are they then engaged in our preaching. So I'm teaching a class on prophetic preaching, I want to say next fall. And then I'll also be offering courses in sermon mechanics, which is an outworking of what Dr. Hook does with embodiment, where she deals with the groundedness of it. And I'm dealing more with how do we go from page to presentation? How do we then make this transition from, you know, the sermon that we feel to being the sermon that we are? And so, you know, for me, my work is really grounded in broadening and cultivating an imagination. And so by looking at the ways in which we have to then preach in a culture that is not necessarily shaped by some of the democratic norms that we've been espoused, but rethinking prophetic preaching in terms of preaching in the age of oligarchy. And what does it mean to preach when the world pretty much accepts this as fact and much of our preaching has not? And so what is it, what kind of call does that make upon the ways in which we make sense of the text and the world that the text points us to? I think I also have taught courses in hip hop culture and homiletics. And I think at some point I'll teach a course on I don't know, something about preaching in the Bible. I did a course with Stephen Cook and I on preaching in the book of 1 Samuel, and that was really good. So I'm sure that'll come up again at some point. But yeah, just thinking about how do we engage the public square and how has that been done in the text? That's the ways in which I try to build upon what we have here.
So, Professor Turner, would you like to talk a little bit about Deep Calls to Deep and how that builds on what we've been doing in this course?
Yeah. So I'm here to talk to you about your life after you graduate from seminary. So don't worry about this right away, but you can kind of tuck it in your pocket for later. And that is that we do, of course, have Deep Calls to Deep, which is a program that Ruth Anna conceived and gave birth to with this Lilly grant a few years ago. The basic structure of the program is that preachers form into peer groups of 6, ideally, hopefully people that are close to you. That group comes with others to the Virginia Seminary campus. You would come back for a week in June. There's an intensive 1-week residency. And then the group meets together monthly over the course of a year to work together on preaching. And then the following June returns for a closing residency. And the program emphasizes it'll sound very familiar to you because we really tried to think about extending the ideas of the program all the way down into the homiletics curriculum. It emphasizes community, being together, spirituality, being really deeply grounded, imagination, opening up your mind to all of these possibilities, and embodiment, of course, being present not just in your head or in your spirit, but in your body, and how you preach and in how you prepare. So deep calls to deep is the main thing I want you to be aware of. There's no requirement that you have to wait, 5 years after graduation or something like that. But it's a good idea to get started, get your feet under you, and then come back to that program. Deep Calls to Deep has been influencing other things that we offer. So I know you'll hear more from Lifelong Learning before you graduate about different continuing education opportunities. And Deep Calls to Deep is a part of that. So there's also some shorter chances to refresh and renew your preaching as well. Definitely, we want this to be a part of the way that you preach and a part of the way that you live as you serve the church going forward.
Wonderful. Okay, so that hopefully gives you something of a sense of how this course that you are finishing up is really only the beginning of your preaching life, we hope, and your study of preaching. There's lots of different times in your career as a preacher when it is helpful to get input. So both as you're completing your MDiv, but also as you move on into preaching, we hope that you will keep coming back and studying from us and others in our preaching curriculum here at PTS. So now where we want to close this is each of us talking about, very briefly, about why we preach. And if we were meeting in person, the thing we've always done at the end of the semester is a kind of moment where everybody in the course sitting around in the classroom writes a brief 1-sentence statement on an index card. Why do I preach? And then we go around the whole circle of the class and everybody reads what they've written. And it's an amazingly moving moment in our course because it just says, it demonstrates that there's just a tremendous amount of passion and a tremendous amount of purpose in each one of you when you think about why you preach. And whenever I hear this whole array of answers to that question, it feels very inspiring to me and hopeful as I think about the church and the world that you all are going into. So what we actually want to do is invite you to a short group Zoom meeting on December 3rd at 11:45. So right after the morning sections have ended and in that little window before lunch, where we will join in a Zoom meeting and ask you all to say in 1 sentence why you preach. And we will hopefully get as many of you as we can to answer that question. We're not going to take more than half an hour to meet all together because we just want to hear everybody say that in brief, and to replicate that experience that we've talked about having in our classroom. So in preparation for that, we are all going to say, the 3 of us are going to say, to start with, why we preach. I would say that the reason why I preach is that I want to be closer to the divine mystery, and I want to draw other people into the divine mystery. Professor Jefferson.
If I say it's hard to top that, no, I preach because hope is in the preaching. Hope is actually in the act of the preaching.
And Professor Jefferson. Sorry, Professor Turner.
I preach because it integrates me as a person, which is very self-centered, but I hope not selfish. Preaching is what I need to do to be the person that God has made me to be in service to the world.
That's lovely. So those are our reasons for preaching. And we'd like you to think about your own reason and join us on December 3rd. I'll send a Zoom link out so that we can be together for that. And I think we'll stop there, although are there closing words from my colleagues?
I'll just say that within the assignments that you've done this semester is your own makings of a homiletic method. And in the years that come from this, hopefully you'll find seeds of your future preaching voice in this experience. And so please see it as a well to be renewed from, and not just a class that you managed to make it through.
And I'll just say I'm really grateful for you all, especially those of you who are in my sections I've come to know, but I'm aware there's a whole bunch of you that are on the other side of this camera that I haven't really come to know. But I'm grateful to you for hanging with us in this really important work in this hard time.
All right, thank you.